Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It's Thursday here in Minnesota. So it means it's Thursday evening in Europe and probably heading into the morning in the Far East of Friday. I hope you all enjoyed that Blue Note series. It was kind of fun showing the entire collection. Again, the entire LP sequence is there from the Alfred and Frank years from the beginning of the LP era in 55 through to the sale in 67. There's stuff that didn't get released at that time and has come out since in Japan or another series. Of course, Tone Pole is doing a lot of that stuff now. I showed you a lot of those gaps being filled in. And as Tone Pole continues to release those titles, I will add them in. There's titles coming after the sale that I will buy down the road when I'm buying records again, which I'm not right now. But nothing that I'm like, oh, I can't believe I don't have that, you know. And a lot of that stuff post-sale starts to blend fusion and avant-garde and just a lot of kind of wild elements, or becomes very saccharine R&B, almost CTI-like, some of it's very schmaltzy, Don Sebesky like. And then there's some 10-inch stuff I don't got. A lot of the 10-inch stuff I don't have was issued on the LP sequence. There's not a lot of Blue Note stuff I don't have from that era. However, there's quite a bit of stuff from that 5,000 sequence. Or is it 9,000? The Dixieland series. There's probably 25 titles in that. I probably only have 5 or 6 of those. But that stuff I'll pick up as I see. A lot of that Dixieland stuff wasn't reissued. The Sidney Bechet, the other elements from that time. That stuff hasn't been reissued a lot. So you got to kind of find the originals. And those originals will still go for pretty good money. But they also sit there a long time, I feel like. So you can usually negotiate and get those at a good price. Almost always. So people kind of want to see the Prestige series next. I hope the viewership stays up through that whole sequence like it has with the Blue Note. I think all 5 Blue Notes are at or close to 1,000 views. And, boy, I'd love to be a channel that got more views than 1,000 or 1,500 views on an episode. But I think that's part of the nature of what we're talking about here. Pretty detailed, deep jazz information and collectors. And the surface people probably aren't going to dig too deep into that kind of stuff. And there's not a lot of glitz and glamour on this channel for, the casual viewer to be sucked in by. But that's the nature of the beast. And, I'm okay with that for the most part. I do sometimes see other guys with channels. I'm like, man, we used to have similar subscribers. And you got like 10,000 now. I'm like, but I guess I can only be what I am. I'm not gonna start doing cartwheels and doing things I don't know or care about. I'm gonna stick with where I'm at. So before I jump into the next sequence, Prestige, and to be clear, people have asked. There's a lot of labels we could do like that. I just know once we get past Blue Note and Prestige, maybe the first 150 Impulse, Riverside, the viewership will start declining. If I were to show the complete Storyville, or the complete Roost, or the complete Argo, how many people would watch that stuff? If I posted the first 150 Emercy, in 3 parts, how many people would watch that? I don't know. I think it's good reference, and hopefully people will utilize that and be able to search that stuff and use it as something that they refer to when they're out shopping. But part of what this episode here today is going to be is about how to collect jazz records. And it's a much more difficult thing than collecting rock and roll bands or funk bands or hip hop artists. Those things are much more finite in their realm and their scope. If you get into Led Zeppelin, there's 10 records, and then there's posthumous live records and box sets, but there's 10 records. That's it. And even one of those is a live record, one of those is outtakes after Bonham died, Coda. So it's a pretty finite career. If you're collecting the Eagles, it's fairly finite. Neil Young, he's got probably 50, 60 records now, but it's still a contained, easy to find reference thing. And he didn't do a ton of work outside. He does actually some with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, So let's have a Buffalo Springfield, makes a record with Pearl Jam. So Neil is kind of an interesting cat in that way. Of course, Neil is in the whole Spotify discussion right now. Uh, I love Neil. I love his integrity. It's Joe Rogan is what it is, you know. Rogan's speaking to his audience, and I watch Rogan sometimes. I think some of his stuff's interesting. I think some of it's ridiculous, but he's not afraid to put anything on there, which I'll tip my hat to that. Yeah, I don't want to have freedom of speech just for the liberals. I don't want to have freedom of speech just for the conservatives. If I'm going to be critical of a pretended war cause, like weapons of mass destruction, and say, you know what, the media is lying, and someone's telling them to lie, it's difficult for me to point the finger at the right when they say that media is lying about something else. We can't have it both ways. And my honest gut tells me that the media tells the people what the corporations want the people to know, regardless of politics. And the polarity means that one side's always going to either be pro-media or anti-media. But I don't think the media has a whole lot of inertia of their own in this game. They don't have the agenda here. They are puppeted and steered by the powers above. And I don't think even political alliances are behind much of the media. I think the media is completely fabricated to create this quagmire, this stalemate. And every single news event that happens is presented in such a way on both channels to polarize. And that's a reason why the guys who are on those channels sometimes leave, because they can't stand the dishonest shading. You know, and I don't think that the events are fabricated so much as it is simply how we report this is going to inflame or stir something up in one side and gain support from the other. And so both sides can take the same event and report it from a different viewpoint and leave both sides equally enraged. And the enraged viewer, it makes them feel engaged, part of the system. Makes them feel like they're part of democracy, which is so ridiculous. You know, being angry and upset because you watch TV for too long doesn't make you part of the system. It makes you part of the problem. And the TV is probably one of the last places we should be getting too much of our information from, especially from one source. And I would argue that to get your media in America from even both sides of the aisle, you're getting a small percentage of the truth. You know, you should really cross-reference everything you think and believe with international information. And I think people living in most other countries are much more willing to embrace other nations' reporting, other nations' viewpoints. And those neutral opinions should matter to us. Those people without a stake in the game, they're often going to be the most subjective. And the fact that we're so unwilling to entertain other news sources speaks to the indoctrination. And again, the whole nationalism thing, to be so wound up in the nation you're born in, it's mind-boggling. It's the opposite of freedom. It's control at the highest of level. I've said before, the event going on right now in Beijing, that's what nationality is for. Go cheer for your favorite figure skater. Leave it there. You know what I mean? Leave it there. Nations don't define you. The nation you were born in doesn't have much bearing at all on who you are. Your family has a bigger impact on you. Your race and religion and language have a bigger impact on you. And as I've said to you before, nation doesn't define any of those things. Languages, religions, races, they bleed across borders endlessly. And there's very few borders that actually define those things. Look up a map of the world's languages. Find me some countries. Look up a map of the world's religions and find me some countries. Nations don't define those things. When you cross the border from Tanzania into Kenya or from Algeria into Libya, languages don't change, or sometimes languages will change 500 times within one small country. Nigeria has like 500 languages within a small well, it's not a small country. We see Africa so small on the map. Nigeria is a pretty big country. But just when you really break down nation, which I spent my whole life studying countries. I have the world tattooed on my arm. Planet Earth is the club I belong to. And so when you start looking at nations closely, what they define, when you cross a border somewhere, what changes instantly is economics. What you pay for a cup of coffee, how much a tank of gas costs, what currency you use. That's what's impacted. And are you going to allow that to define you and say, though, that currency, that price for gasoline, that's who I am? It's fucking stupid. It's fucking mind-numbingly dumb to wave a flag and think that defines freedom and you're being some kind of patriot. You want to be patriotic? You want to be proud of who you are? Be proud to be a human earthling, because that's all you can really be sure of. All those other markers, all those other definitions that we've put on our cans, you need to peel those labels off. Why proudly profess an ingredient that you aren't sure you have? I'm a human earthling. That's all I'm sure of. And that heritage is much more broad. It's much more encompassing. It's much more enabling. I don't have to be guided by the rules and guidelines of my society. I can look at a much bigger picture, excuse me, and have a much more enabling pretense for who I am and what I want to be. I've said this before. I've said it to my children for a long time. And I'm going to share it again here because it's been a while since I've said it. But I had this epiphany years ago studying geography and maps. And you realize when you study maps, and I have tons of atlases, tons of them. And I have lots of smaller little regional maps and, small little, the maps of World War II, the maps of Crimea. Just lots of maps. And what you realize is essentially that those maps aren't hard, concrete evidence or truth. They're only true to the moment they were drawn. And sometimes even by the time they're published, they're no longer true. Capitals change, borders change, names change. Who's controlling things change. I mean, rivers can be diverted, dams can be created, lakes can be born. Maps are only significant to the moment of their creation. And so when you have a whole system of maps, they create a three-dimensional tunnel of time. You can see the lines moving, and you realize that each one of those maps is but a slice of the truth. An instant moment of truth. That's all it is. But if you have a map for the next year, 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 or even each decade, suddenly there's a larger truth that compiles to make all those maps have a moment of validity, but there's a larger truth to them. Okay? And that led to this epiphany that the society I'm born into isn't infinite. It's not a defining piece of who I am. A society is like a map. It's a slice in time of a momentary truth. And you need all the other slices of society to govern and to make decisions about who you are going to be, because that broader scope of truth is what reality is. And so the saying is, the opposite of the society you're born into is the reality of all things. And if we lived our lives that way, if we let our philosophies and our guiding principles be, I'm not a product of the society I'm born into, I'm a product of the reality of this human experience. The 10, 12,000 years of recorded history, the 100,000 years of the Great Migration, the million years of Homo sapiens sapiens, that is my legacy. That is what defines me. And that puts all of our temporal borders and creations into perspective and makes them insignificant. And I can no longer be too concerned about what nation I came out of a vagina in. I'm not been sticking my head up in politics very much lately. America is too divided. It's too polarizing. It's too willing to create anger, and I just don't have the time or the heart strength to be that upset all the time and to see the stupidity on both sides. You know, I'm far more liberal than I am conservative, but I find the liberals in this country to be right of center, to be honest. There's not any real far left liberal in this country. It doesn't exist. And the American right, aside from a few extremists, isn't really that far right. You know, there's the American politic exists from right of center to a little further right of center. And that outrage and that divide that thinks that we can't ever be united exists within that small slice of a far greater broad political spectrum. There's not extreme left and extreme right in this country. There's fringes of that, but they aren't really the voice or the power or the governing bodies here that are making the choices. And the illusion of the divide, the illusion of the polarity keeps the status quo in place. And every event, every news headline, every story is presented in a way to keep that balance. Because the quagmire, the stalemate, that's the agenda. Unity is devastating to the powers that be. And it's not government. We shouldn't be afraid of government. It's mind-numbing to be afraid of government. Big corporations have been teaching us to be afraid of government for 100 years. Thinking that government has the conspiracy and the power and the control, and they have the secret agenda, when the average senator from Washington or the average congressman from Iowa usually doesn't have much more at stake than I want a dam built in Washington and I want more corn for my cows in Iowa. They might get into Washington, D.C. and have a broader image pushed upon them of what things should be. But let's not make any mistake that corporate backing isn't responsible for almost all the decision making. And regardless of which party's in power, there's an economic stream, current, that's very little diverged by who happens to be in power at the time. They might steer the ship a little to the left or a little to the right. For the most part, we're still going in the same direction. The government doesn't change, and suddenly all of our allies change, and the wars that we fight change, and the conflicts that we're involved in change, and the places that we're occupying and exploiting changes. None of that changes. All that foreign policy, all that national intervention and destabilization that we take part in, none of that changes because Biden came into power. You know, I mean, Obama didn't stop all the things that the military was doing at the behest of the corporations, CIA. And the CIA has been built and defined as something that protects American interests economically. I mean, it's not just the protecting the people thing. We are sheep, and we're given this democracy thing to think that we're a part of the process, but we're not. And I'm going to end that there. That's all the politics I'm going to give you today. But I've just seen a few things like that. I'm just like, man, people are so dumb to get caught up in this shit. You know, if you had a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more grasp of the human story, migration, you couldn't fall for some of this stuff so simply. So anyway, collecting jazz. How do you do it? How do you go about it? It's so overwhelming. It's so all-encompassing. And you feel like if you haven't jumped in completely, you can't dip your toes in. And I get it. I remember going through some pretty tough times collecting. And one thing for sure is buying stuff online, bidding on stuff at auction, on Discogs. That has muddied the waters in terms of, as a collector, do I have this or not? When you used to shop just in stores in the wild, you would usually know when you saw something, I've never seen that before, instantly. You knew you'd never seen it before. And you would probably buy it if you hadn't seen it before and were interested in it. And even then, there was times you'd be like, oh crap, I'm in a record store. Do I have this Milt Jackson? I know I've seen it a few times. Did I buy it? And it can be kind of a conundrum in your head. Like, do I have this record? I don't know. I'm not sure. And it's frustrating because you got to make that choice of, I don't want to go home, buy this, and then find out I already have it, because that's disappointing. But it's not nearly as disappointing as going home without it and realizing, fuck, that's the one I didn't buy. I thought I had, you know, and it can be confusing. And the more jazz records you buy, the more muddy that water becomes. And then adding into the online shopping thing, I find once you've bid on a record a few times, and especially if you bid on a lot, And this really only applies to people who have probably 500 jazz records or more. Under that envelope, I think the parameters are still fairly clear as to what you have and what you don't. It's when you have 3, 4, 500 jazz records plus, and you've been on a lot, won some and lost some, and you have multiple records by a lot of different artists, and some of these artists' covers can start looking very similar. Again, there's some labels that repackage things endlessly. That's the same music, as I've explained many times. A label like Savoy gives the same record 2, sometimes 3 different covers, partly to kind of update them with new color processing and stuff, because the first covers were black and white, obviously, and they added some color, and they added new photos all together. And so some of those records have 3 covers that, if you don't know, you can come up with the same record 3 times. And nothing's been remixed, or none of the sound has changed, it's just the covers changed. At least Savoy has the good common sense to keep the same sequence numbers on those different covers. So if it's 12076, they'll also be 12076, unlike Prestige, who will make 77,014 into 7162. And so you think it's a whole new number, a whole new release, and it's just that same record with different cover and often different leadership to confuse. And so it came to a time and a place that when I was going to record stores, too often I would sit there being like, man, I'd have to call home and be like, hey, kid, wife, can you look at my section for this and see if I have this Sonny Stitt? Can you go see if I have this Wes Montgomery record? I know I've seen it a lot. I don't know if I've ever bought it or not. I can't remember if I brought this home. Sometimes if it's a local store, you'll put something on hold to be sure. But, the more jazz you buy, the more unsure you become. And again, sometimes records labels will have very similar art departments for a lot of their releases. So sometimes a guy like Milt Jackson on Savoy will have 5 records, or Hank Jones, and some of the covers will look really similar. And it become like, man, is this the one I have or is this one I don't have? I don't know. And so how do you clear that up? And I'm going to show you what I did. And it started very simply. Once I was collecting jazz for probably 6 years, 7 years, I probably had about 1,000 jazz records at that point. What I decided to do finally was to print off from Wikipedia my favorite artists' discographies, which Wikipedia will list. And so suddenly I had a printout of Milt Jackson's releases, and I highlighted the things I had, which meant that when I was in a store, oh, there's a Milt Jackson. Do I have this one? I could just pull up my printout and look at it. Be like, oh, I don't have this one on Atlantic. Cool. And I only printed out the ones that I was really into at the time, and that I had quite a few records by. If you only have 2 records by John Coltrane, you don't need the printout. But when you get to be having 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 records by certain artists, those printouts can become very valuable. And oftentimes even the printout will say, this record that was released in 1975 is a repackaging on a different label of the album that was released in 1962. And so you have that information at your fingertips now. So if you print out a Miles Davis discography and a John Coltrane discography and a Milt Jackson discography and a Kenny Burrell discography and Wayne Shorter and all your favorites, Lee Morgan, Hank Mobley, you just print out your favorite 24 jazz artists and have those discographies at your fingertip. It will give you a valuable resource to look at. And I'm going to show you some stuff here. So that right there is the Sonny Stitt printout. And I started doing this where I used color to signify what label was which. But I ran out of colors eventually. And so like green here is Riverside. The bright red is Prestige. I think the pinks are mostly Argos. Blue was mostly Verve. But some of the Impulse was always orange. But some of that kind of got lost over the years. And I started just kind of making the colors whatever they were, just to kind of make them look interesting. And so there's Sonny Stitt up to 1965. I think I have 55, 56 different Sonny Stitt records. And you start filling in all those as you go along. Here's a guy like Idris Suleiman, who doesn't have a lot as a leader. I have his first 4 records as a leader, and there's a bunch of his side work. The guys who are mostly sidemen, you print off their side work to get that story of where they were a part of. And there's a lot of Idris Suleiman's work. Ira Sullivan, Gabor Szabo. Let's jump ahead here a little bit, see what we find. Ernie Wilkins, Ben Webster, Cedar Walton. A lot of his leadership stuff doesn't start till the 60s and 70s. Dinah Washington, Mal Waldron. Mal does quite a bit as a leader, but he's also a prolific sideman, as we'll see there. I'm going to jump back here a little bit. So here's John Coltrane, and that's all the Prestige stuff. I think yellow was Blue Note at this point. Purple was Atlantic at this point. Orange is Impulse. And Coltrane gets a fairly deluxe printout because he's such a giant. You know, there's all his Impulse work. And you can just kind of collect and bring these printouts with you. And of course, as my collection grew, and as my knowledge grew, and as the number of artists I was into grew, you start having to add printouts. There's Count Basie, his 50s stuff, his 60s stuff, more Basie there. Curtis Counts, his leader stuff, his side work. And this book, there's Lou Donaldson, there's all his Blue Note work with his Argo stuff in the middle there. Paul Desmond, Buddy DeFranco, Eddie Lockjaw Davis. It's a valuable tool to have. And there's Art Farmer's work. Art Farmer's work as a leader is prolific. His work as a sideman is incredible. And as most of you know, my collection is very focused on the 50s and 60s, and I have some 70s and 80s, but not much. So most of these artists will be fairly filled in that 50s, 60s era, but then the stuff from the 70s and 80s will be just little pieces here and there by them. So I certainly don't know those later eras the same way. Maynard Ferguson, Tommy Flanagan. Flanagan does a lot of recording as a leader in the 70s and 80s, but in the classic years of the 50s and 60s, he does very little as a leader, but his side work at that point was prolific. He was just on a lot. Look at all that work. You know, it's just incredible the amount of work some of these guys do as sidemen. Paul Chambers. See if we can find him real quick. And eventually, the printouts became so large that I put them in a binder. And I just carried the binder with me, and record store owners would be like, "Oh, what do you got there?" And I'll explain to them, and they're like, "Oh, that's so cool." So there's Paul Chambers' work as a leader. Fairly small, minuscule. Look at his work as a sideman now. I have that Toshihiko now. That's awesome. I need to highlight that here. And so what you do is you keep highlighting stuff. But in the process of highlighting stuff, you're actually learning as well. And you're learning the labels. You're learning when guys were on what label. So look at Paul Chambers' work as a leader. That little bit there. Then all this. And then all that. And this is his Coltrane work. Sonny Criss, Miles Davis, Kenny Dorham, Kenny Drew, Curtis Fuller, Red Garland, Benny Golson, Benny Green, Johnny Griffin, Jimmy Heath, Ernie Henry, Groove Holmes, Elmo Hope, Freddie Hubbard, Milt Jackson, John Jenkins, J.J. Johnson, Elvin Jones, Hank Jones, Thad Jones, Clifford Jordan, Wynton Kelly, Abbey Lincoln, Les McCann, Hal McCusick, Lou Mitchell, Hank Mobley, Morgan, Monk, Montgomery, Oliver Nelson, Phineas Newborn, David Fathead Newman, Art Pepper, Houston Person, Bud Powell, Ike Quebec, Paul Kinechet, Freddie Red, Dizzy Reese, Sonny Rollins, A.K. Salim, Sahib Shihab, Woody Shaw, Wayne Shorter, Lewis Smith, Sonny Stitt, Frank Strozier, Art Taylor, Clark Terry, Julius Watkins, Kai Winding. So you can see Paul Chambers' body of work as a sideman is just incredible. And once you start filling all that in, it escalates and improves your opinion of what Paul Chambers was about. You can't just say Paul Chambers is that. because Paul Chambers was a part of a lot of the changing scene for decades. You know, not for decades. He dies pretty young. He dies like 69 or something. But here's Kenny Burrell. And Burrell's interesting because these are all his records as a leader up until 1986. And there's over 40 that I have highlighted that I own on many different labels. And oftentimes the guys who are prolific sidemen aren't prolific leaders, and often the prolific leaders aren't prolific sidemen. A guy like Kenny Burrell, let's just take a look. There's Burrell's side work. It's endless. We're going to jump ahead here more. Burrell. Wynton Kelly's another guy, just an incredible body of work. Come on. As a sideman. You can just see how much work Kenny Burrell does here. Even more. Here's Donald Byrd's work as a leader. And then Byrd's work as a sideman. And Byrd does quite a bit of side work, actually. You know. So, these printouts became very informational and educational. And besides learning the artists and their chronology and their history, you're also learning the different labels, and you're also seeing what labels guys were on, which helps you discover new labels. And whenever you see a label pop up on 3 or 4 different artists, like a Jubilee, that you didn't really know about Jubilee, but you see that so-and-so has it, he recorded for the, and you're like, man, 6 or 7 great artists recorded on Jubilee. I need to check out Jubilee. And so you'll learn a lot. And this binder has gotten this thick now over the course of 5 years of doing it. So what started out as maybe a couple dozen that I carried around in a plastic bag, you know, to record stores, you slowly add more and more artists, and you add more and more artists. And you only got to add a few artists a week as you expand your knowledge and as you're buying records. And now you can see this binder probably has 300 artists in it, I'm going to guess. And that only accounts for guys who have large bodies of work. I don't really do printouts for artists that only make a couple records or are only on a few records as a sideman, depending on how important they were. But like on the trading cards, I'm doing almost 700, and a lot of those guys just don't have enough work as a leader. Or so this covers the LP era pretty well. The earlier era, it's still tougher. So it's a great asset, a great tool, and a great way to get to learn. And when you bring it with you, it helps you shop. Now, I went one step further, and I created a second binder here. And this binder is for record labels. And it houses probably 20 or so of the biggest labels. And it helps me keep chronology of what I have from each label. And this is part of how I learned to complete a lot of these labels, was by having these printouts. And again, you can go to Wikipedia for the most part, and you can find most of these labels fairly easily. And sometimes it takes a little searching to find them. But here's Atlantic. And these labels will go on for pages, you know, and you're filling that stuff in, and you're learning the chronology, you're learning the history, you're seeing when labels were important, when they were cutting edge. Bethlehem. That's actually Argo right here, I think. No, it's Bethlehem. There's all the Bethlehem titles. This is how you know when you have all the Bethlehem stuff. There's the 10-inch sequence. There's all of it. A few more there, a couple unissued. So you know that those numbers, you're never going to find them because they were never issued. And then this first BCP one, that was never issued. And so again, it's just there's so much to be learned by doing it this way. Again, with Bethlehem here, you have a bunch of compilations that these actually came out, I think, once King took over. And they're really rare, actually. But they're all just stuff from the earlier material. And so you don't need to collect that stuff. This is a small 5,000 sequence with some interesting, less jazz stuff on there. Then here's the 6,000 sequence. And again, some compilations there. And you see that's mostly filled in. There's a Shantyman record right there I don't have. And that's like not jazz. And there's a various artists and a Coltrane reissue, which has already been issued. I got a couple more compilations. So here's Blue Note. So here's some of the 10-inch stuff I was talking about. There's more 10-inch. There's the 7,000 stuff. Then here's 1,500. Everything's highlighted. This was the first label I really went through and got to know. And you can see everything. It's just highlighted. Highlighted. Not released. Not released, not released. And then this is when we get to the point of the sale right about there. And that's where I start to have some stuff that's missing. There's that Tyrone Washington. Again, I could have swore I had that. It's one of those records where I thought I bought it 5 times and never bought it once. I'm guessing. So, and then some of the later stuff and some of the LA sequence stuff I was talking to you about. And so you just learn a lot from these printouts. Candid records. I only have about 11 or 12 of them. They get pretty far out, some of them. There's some stuff in there I like to get, like the Clark Terry, Lightning Hopkins, which is the blues, of course, Benny Bailey. There's a Toshiko record I like to pick up at some point, Cecil Taylor. This is the Capitol 6500 series, which is the best stuff that Capitol does. It's mostly that Stan Kenton Presents stuff. It's really good. And then there's all my Capitols right there is 140. I haven't done a printout for Capitol. I don't think I've even found one. There's contemporary records. There's 3600 sequence. Here's Chorale, which I just wrote out the Chorale sequence because it's a 57,000 sequence. And a lot of it's not jazz. A lot of it's easy listening and schmaltz. So I just wrote down the titles of the jazz records that I've bought. Because there's, that crosses from 57 to 59. So it's 2,000 records. And that's the good jazz stuff in there on Chorale. And Chorale's a Decca subsidiary. Here's CTI. We'll skip past that for now. Here's the Dawn label. And that's it. That's the entire Dawn sequence. And you can see once you have it filled in, there's a collection there I don't got. A couple things here that aren't jazz at the very end. This is the Decca 9200 series. And that's one of the best jazz sequences on Decca. There's Delmark out of Chicago, who I like to fill more Delmark in over the years. Electra had a small sequence. Here's Emersy. You can see Emersy just has page after page. Epic. This is some of the best Epic stuff. And they have a second sequence, which is even more jazz-oriented. The 16,000 series. Everest Records has some good stuff. Here's Fantasy. Fantasy actually wasn't on Wikipedia. I had to go to the special website to find the Fantasy printouts. I had to shrink them down so they didn't take up too much space. But Fantasy has a lot of great stuff, especially early on. They also buy out Debut at the end. So Debut ends up being there's Felstead, a UK label. G and PG Norman Presents. They have some great stuff. You only need early material to really get that classic era. Clifford Brown, Dizzy Gillespie, that stuff's fantastic. But there's so many cool labels like this. There's Impulse, page after page after page. And then Jarro's a small little label. Jazz West is a small label that took me a while to complete. Very rare, these records. Here's Jubilee, which is just page after page again. There's so many cool labels. King was in there. Pacific Records. Nocturne, which I completed. Here's the Mode record label. Metro Jazz, which I completed. There's some of the King stuff. And so there's a lot of labels stuck in here. Here's Prestige, and Prestige is just like page after page after page after page after page. They did so much stuff. And some of the yellow stuff here is stuff that I found that was reissued. Early Miles 5153 is a reissue of 7025. Work by Sonny Rollins was a reissue of 7075. So I highlighted them in yellow, knowing that I don't really need to buy those. If I find one cheap, used, with a nice cover, maybe I'll buy it. Twister Gene M is a reissue of that. So you learn all that history as well. There's a Sonny Rollins that I have original and a reissue of. So much information here on all those are reissued. Prestige, it just goes on and on and on. And I've slowly got my Prestige up into the 7300s, where I'm missing my first few Prestige titles of actual new material. And then Prestige starts to thin out into the 74s and 7500s. But then Prestige also has the New Jazz sequence, which is coming up here. There's New Jazz. And New Jazz is almost 100 titles of really great stuff. And then Prestige also has the Swingville and the Moodsville sequence, which was happening simultaneously with the New Jazz and with Prestige sequence. Here's Riverside. And again, there's 400 titles here on Riverside. So you're learning a lot about the labels as well as the artists at this point. You're seeing what labels signed what artists, how they approach their work. Were they very integral about it? Were they doing a lot of cheesy repackaging? Riverside's high integrity stuff, very much like Blue Note. This is the Jazzland sequence, which was also obviously Riverside. Roost, which has a large 10-inch sequence, which I've almost completed. There's a couple early ones I'm missing, but I have most of the Roost 10 inches at this point. There's the Roost 12 inches, which I have completed that. Then there's Roulette, who ended up buying Roost. There's a lot of cool little labels right here in the R section. Here's Savoy, which is the 10-inch stuff there. And here's the Savoy 12,000 sequence, which you can see is pretty much all filled in. And then there's some Regent stuff here, which Regent was a label that Savoy bought. And some of this is really great jazz, especially around 57, 58. They start doing some pretty great stuff on Regent, which is right in that era, where you can see I have most of it. And then we're doing Storyville out of Boston, a great little label. I've completed the Storyville 10-inch sequence, which is what this is right here. I think there's like 23 of them. Great stuff, fantastic album covers, a lot of them by Burt Goldblatt. And then after the 10-inch sequence, we move into the 900 sequence, which is LPs. And there's only about 18 of those. And then Storyville gets bought out by somebody else. Tampa Records. Tampa's one of the most convoluted labels. They're buying up a lot of the small labels. Almost all the records have 2 or 3 different covers. Here's Time, the Bob Shad label, which has some pretty good jazz on it. Transition. Pretty rare stuff out of Boston by, I think his name was Tom Wilson, who created Transition. United Artists, which was a film company, who has 2 great jazz sequences. This is the 15,000, and this is the 4,000, which has the kind of different sequences. The one's more jazz-centric than the other one here. So United Artists was very important. Here's Urania, a nice little label out of New York that does some pretty solid stuff. Here's Vanguard, another great label with a great 10-inch sequence, some great 12-inch stuff. Here's VJ, a great label out of Chicago. So you can see I have filled in most of the VJ material. You know, it's great stuff. Shorter, Morgan, just solid. And then we get the Verve, and there's some Norgran, there's some Clef, which I wrote it myself. There's Ella Fitzgerald's 4,000 stuff. And see, some of these pages are getting pretty ripped up because I reference these so often. But then we're in the Verve, and here's the Verve, and Verve is just page after page after page after page. 800 some titles in this sequence. And you can see Verve is just, it's thick. You know, it's thick. And they do quite a few collections and greatest hits at Verve as well. And then we move into Columbia, which Columbia is such a weird label because they put everything on the same sequence number, from country to beer bong songs to jazz. So it's very sporadic. The Armstrong, the Ellington, the Brubeck, the Miles. There's just titles here and there that are great jazz titles. Once in a while they delve a little deeper. I think 58, 59 was probably the best era for Columbia jazz. But there's some great stuff in the early 50s as well. So here you start seeing when Miles and Art Blakey and those guys start showing up. So again, that's the idea here. So the idea here is just to have reference. And I've often found that my phone doesn't work great internet-wise in a lot of record stores. I think sometimes it's because of the locations the record stores are in. Often the kind of old concrete bunker buildings or in basements. I've been in very few record stores over the years where my internet on my phone was working great. You know, I was sitting there trying to, and it just won't load. You know, so having these binders, these printouts, for me has been a lifesaver. And now that I've filled in so much of that stuff, and now that I shop a lot online, even shopping online, All the time I'll be buying something from my store and I'm like, oh, I want that. And I'll look what else this guy has, and I'll find 3 or 4 titles. Like, do I have that one? And I'll go look at my binders. Like, oh yeah, I need that one. Oh, I don't need that one. Because you do forget. You do forget. I mean, especially when you've seen something a lot. You know, do I have this Prestige? I know I've seen this Jack McDuff a ton. I've passed it over. Have I bought that? I have 25 Jack McDuff records. I don't remember. So the binders are pretty awesome ways to really get to know the jazz sequences and learn while you're doing it. You know, and I don't think it really applies to people who are just kind of beginning. I mean, you can do a few printouts and have that access to them, but by all means, don't just get stuck buying 1 or 2 jazz titles and jazz artists. You need to spread your palette out wide, and this especially goes for beginners, so you can decide for yourself what jazz you like. Do not let the critics, do not let so-called experts, the people on these Facebook groups, you know, don't even let me tell you what you like. Let your ears tell you. I won't tell you what you should eat and what you're going to like to eat because you know better. And it's the same with jazz. Trust your ears. If you like something, I don't care what anybody else says. If you like Dave Brubeck, great. Love him. He's fantastic. He's accessible. He's fun to listen to. If you like Ornette Coleman, great. He's not easy to listen to. And that's the choice you made. And so many people, I think, are so influenced by the media out there that they don't take into account their own thoughts and opinions and feelings about something. And that's kind of insane. And I think it's a way to end up buying a lot of records you're not going to really listen to for a long time. So start broad and then narrow down your scope to what you do like. If I had to make any recommendation to people, piano trios and guitar jazz are jazz I think you'll never get tired of listening to. You'll be able to play it when your friends are there. You'll be able to play it when you're feeling melancholy, when you're having your morning coffee. Some Red Garland or Wynton Kelly in the morning is fantastic. Some Kenny Burrell, Wes Montgomery, Grant Green guitar. Oh, there's a lot of great guitar players from the 50s. I'm a huge fan of jazz guitar. Jazz guitar stuff's very accessible. Most of us are, especially as white cats, we come from a rock and roll background, so we can relate to guitar. It's familiar to us. So there's a lot of great guitar players from the jazz era, the 50s and 60s, that are very approachable and very listenable. And a lot of them are under the radar. A guy like Sal Salvador, a lot of people aren't collecting him. And he's got just fantastic stuff. Joe Puma, outstanding stuff. Dick Garcia, love these guys. Joe Cinderella does some great work. Mostly as a sideman, sadly. Pat Martino. There's so many great guitar players. Joe Pass. You know, I mean, it's just, the list is endless. Jim Hall. There's so many different eras, too. From the bebop era to the modern era to the modal era. Kenny Burrell is one of the greats. He covers so many different aspects of what jazz guitar was about. And so I think if you're kind of a beginner, jazz guitar, jazz piano trios are a great way to come in. And then you can add the horns and decide how much horn you want in your life. And I'll be honest, there's days where I'll go all day putting on a jazz horn record. Sometimes I don't need horns. Horns are very abrasive. They're very bright. They're very piercing. Especially trumpets can be really, you know, trombones are more fluid and syrupy, and saxophones are a little bit more throaty in like the human voice. So saxophones are a little bit easier on the ears sometimes. But some of the big brass sections can be very bright. Some of the Stan Kenton stuff, Woody Herman, some of those big bands with the big, huge trumpet, that stuff can be a lot. That's why I love guys like Clifford Brown, because there's a softness in their tone. As bright as he is, he's always very melodic and centered, and it's always very digestible. That's why I love Kenny Dorham, Art Farmer, even Miles Davis, for the most part, quite digestible. Although I find some of his stuff, especially with the second quintet, can be kind of piercing digitally. You know, when I listen to it in the car, I'm like, God, that trumpet's so piercing my eyeballs. But trumpet's most likely to be that to people. It's just a bright, intense little sound. So that's the binders in a nutshell. A little political rant I had to get out of my system. Hope you all enjoy that. I recommend highly to people who have a broader collection in jazz, start doing printouts. Print out your favorite 24 jazz artists. Highlight the stuff you got. Know for a fact which stuff you don't have. And if you shop frequently enough, those printouts, if you bring them with you, they will be like, oh, let me check real quick. Do I have that? And you will find it valuable. A guy like Jimmy Smith, 50, 60 records. You'll want to know sometimes, oh shit, Jimmy Smith live at Small's Paradise. I know I got one of the 2 volumes. Do I have volume 1 or do I have volume 2? And there's a slight change in the color, but everything else is the same looking. And so I think people should check that out. It's pretty noteworthy. I guess I'm going to try doing the Prestige discography next. See if people watch like they watch the Blue Note. I hope they do. People seem to be clamoring for it. I don't think Prestige will keep people's interest as long as the Blue Note sequence did. And the Blue Note sequence gets into the avant-garde and some very collectible pieces even later in its discography. And Prestige kind of goes away from that stuff once New Jazz kind of shuts down. And they become very soul jazz centric into the mid-60s. And so I think we're going to lose some people on those episodes. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. There's a lot of great labels I could do. As you see in the book of the binder there, I could do episodes on a lot of great labels where I have the lion's share of their work, which, again, it's a very educational thing. And again, my binder, there was no Jazz Shepherd channel for me to watch. So you could watch this channel and get some of this information. But again, in the store, sometimes it's hard to get the online stuff to work. So anyway, that's today's episode. I wanted to cover that for people who've been asking about it. Y'all be safe. Have a great day. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. If you want to support the channel, go to the Patreon in the link below and donate a little bit of funds to help the channel support itself. And if you want to buy some merchandise or some cool stuff in the store, in the description below, go to the store and check out the hoodies, the coffee cups, the t-shirts. There's even some sweatpants and socks. There's some fun stuff in there. Appreciate you all. Be safe. Love.